good afternoon, and thank you all very much for joining us today for this insightful program where we will be taking a deep dive into cannabis licenses, the process, the pain, and the eventual profit of being a coveted license holder. Before we get started, how many of you out there have played the lottery? It's okay. Your secret is safe with me. Go ahead, raise your hand. Did you know that several states, including Arizona, use a lottery method to award their legal cannabis licenses? So I was thinking, what a better way to start today's program than replaying the lottery in Arizona last month, where they awarded 13 new licenses. Hold on one second, I'm just sharing my screen because a visual speaks much more than just words. So here's what that looked like. Each ball in the lottery drawing represented an applicant who paid a non-refundable $25,000 for the chance to win. The state collected about $9.4 million from these applicants. So that quick math is 376 license applications for 13 licenses. Each applicant also had to have $500,000 of capital available and a proposed location for where they will open in the counties where they applied. These licenses were for adult use only, and each applicant could submit no more than 5 applications per county. Officials wearing cloth gloves used scissors to cut open an evidence bag with the balls, poured them carefully into a bingo machine, closed the clear plastic dome, and turned on the machine. The procedure called for allowing the balls to circulate for at least 15 seconds. After approximately 20 to 30 seconds, they pulled a stopper off the top of the machine and withdrew a ball. N35, N35. The identity of the applicant was not immediately disclosed by the Arizona Department of Health Services, though. The department later released a list, including the winner's address. The machine was then restarted for another 15 seconds or more, and a second ball was drawn. I-30. So after holding the balls out for approximately 20 people in the room to witness, they were placed in a new evidence bag with the rest of the balls for that county and sealed. All kidding aside, securing a license in a regulated market is a challenge. But like Arizona here, these licenses can be worth millions if you get one. So are you ready to play the lottery? Our expert panel today will dive deep into this process, not just Arizona, but across the country. Moderating today is David Abernathy. He is principal at Arcview Management Consulting and also an expert in playing the lottery. I mean, the legal cannabis regulatory landscape. And he's here and ready to help. David, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for that great intro. It really is. It's a super competitive process in a lot of states, and it varies a lot from state to state. So we're very fortunate to be joined by some fantastic panelists who are going to help us understand what that landscape looks like and also what you can do to improve your odds, right? Unlike a traditional lottery, you don't just have to buy a ticket and then wait to see if you win. There's a lot of work you can do to ensure that you have the best chances of winning some of these competitive licenses. So with that, I'd love to introduce Eddie Armstrong from Cannabis Capital Group, as well as John Engle, also from Cannabis Capital Group. Arcview Management Consulting has recently partnered with Cannabis Capital Group to really bring their expertise on competitive license application process into the fold and help our clients deal with issues related to that. I'd also like to welcome Robert DeBin, who has been through the process of applying for and receiving competitive licenses, and hopefully in in just a moment, we will be joined by Dr. April Spencer, who I understand is dealing with a patient at the moment, and obviously that takes priority. Dr. Spencer is currently in the process of applying for a license in Georgia. So with that, Eddie, I'd love to start with you and have you give us a quick introduction to who you are and what brought you here.
Thank you, David. And thank you to all the participants today as well. And Kim, thank you for having us, Arcview. We're really excited about our relationship. I'm Eddie Armstrong. I'm Arkansas born and raised. I started my career in government affairs and lobbying in the food and agriculture industry, as well as business development for a medical laboratory. And then I ran for the State House of Representatives, and I won in a three-way race. And quickly after galvanizing those reins, I was elected by my peers as House Minority Leader, where right at the same time, the legalization of cannabis was coming into the industry and to the agenda of state houses across the country. And then after leaving office, I founded the Cannabis Capital Group with my partner, John Engle, which is a boutique consulting firm that really wanted to specialize in democratizing the green rush. And that meant a lot to us because of our story and how we actually got into the cannabis industry, but bringing forth access for all people was something that we were really focused on. And today we're dedicated to empowering, entrepreneurs from non-traditional backgrounds to access this industry and find ways to be a part of this unique opportunity in time and history.
Great. Thanks, Eddie. John, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I'm John Engle. I am the Chief Investment Officer of the Cannabis Capital Group. I've been working with Eddie almost since the beginning after he decided to move past beyond Arkansas and bring cannabis consulting nationwide. And my background is in finance and investment, especially into early stage. So helping small businesses get off the ground is sort of my sweet spot when it came to that. So that's what I bring to the cannabis licensing space.
Excellent. And Robert.
Yeah, thanks, David. My name is Robert DeBin. I'm the president of Natural State Medicinals. We are a licensed cultivator in Arkansas. We're one of 5. We cultivate, extract, and manufacture medical cannabis flower, concentrate, and infused products.
Great. Thanks. And Dr. Spencer, thanks for joining us today, and I'd love it if you could give us a quick intro to who you are and a little bit about what you're doing in Georgia and what brings you here.
Sure, and thanks for having me, David. I am a board-certified general surgeon with a specialty in breast cancer surgery, and I am currently the CEO of Pure Relief, which is a cannabis group, and we're looking to obtain a license in Georgia. And I got involved almost a decade ago in making sure that Georgians had access to alternatives to narcotics like CBD and medical cannabis so that they can have relief from their pain and suffering without increasing the risk for overdosing, increasing polypharmacy in the elderly, and just really wanted to maximize the benefit and reduce the toxicity of just giving just the opioid crisis. And so I'm just excited that you all have me here today outside the surgical space, but using my expertise to help our group have access beyond our clinic, beyond the 4 walls of our office, and to make it available to all Georgians. So we're really excited about that.
Great. Thanks for joining us. So when I got into cannabis about 12 years ago, in California, which is where I started, the medical cannabis industry looked entirely different from what we see today, and there weren't state licenses. If you wanted to operate a cultivation or a dispensary, there was a very short list of guidelines that were part of Prop 215 and subsequent Senate Bill 420 that outlined what you could do. Some local jurisdictions, some cities and counties had an additional regulatory layer, but it was relatively easy to spin up a business, and you didn't have to apply for a competitive license in most parts of California. Since then, we've seen the industry evolve. We've seen dozens of states implement medical and adult use cannabis laws, and the laws that have been implemented are really strikingly varied, to the point that you have states that mandate certain things of cannabis businesses that are prohibited of cannabis businesses in other states. I'm really curious to hear, John, your perspective on what you're seeing in some of these really ultra competitive states in terms of what they're looking for from license applicants.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and the simple answer is it varies very significantly. But the common thread is that it is very complex, and they want to see a lot from the applicant. So it's not just I have a business idea. You have to have a full business plan, your team, your location, financing, usually engineering designs, and everything down to the most important details often of the facility itself and how you're going to run the business, which that's been frequent across all the most recent competitive applications. So that includes Georgia for medical, Illinois most recently in recreational, and it appears to be what will be the dominant pattern across the states that have just recently legalized as well, such as New York. So it's not a matter of a few days. It's a matter of months of preparation and then at least weeks of putting an application together, which can often run to hundreds of pages of explanation.
Excellent. And Eddie, so in some states, if you want to get a license, you basically fill out the application and you meet certain requirements, and if you do, you get it. But Eddie, I'm curious in your perspective, in these more competitive states where just meeting the requirements is not enough, what are some of the things that separate a good license application from a winning license application?
Great question. And again, I think I'll pivot back to John. It varies from state to state. And one of the things that we feel that separates us in our boutique format, our kind of bespoke approach to these applications, is finding niche, finding approaches that traditionally may not be tackled when you approach this industry, that still has a very tribal aspect to it, while there are Fortune 50 practices being put in place. So some of the things that we took advantage of, and Robert now is the helm of, is really looking at the medical, the medicinal, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, healthcare practical approaches to this, not only because it was called medical cannabis or adult use, but what are the real, bare bones to what that truly means in any of these highly regulated states, those that are emerging or those that are currently governing, like Missouri or Arkansas, which was the first southern state to do so. And the regulations to some degree have been really helpful. It's made the company think twice about some of its operations, while at the same time giving consideration to how we have taken that blueprint to some degree and approached our methodologies in other states. It's a tough process. It's a lot more than what most people think, but that's just my set aside for now, I think.
And Robert, as someone who's gone through this process and came out the other side, not only in one piece but with a license and a thriving business, what was that experience like? What was the process like of deciding to apply for this license, putting together the application, going through the process, the uncertainty, the legal challenges? What did that process look like for you?
Yeah, it was a bit of a emotional roller coaster, to be honest. Arkansas first tried to pass medical cannabis in 2012. It failed by a narrow margin. So at that point, it was a pretty safe assumption that the next time it was on the ballot, it was going to pass. So we started getting prepared at that point. Spent a lot of time in legal markets, actually working in some of those facilities and learning best practices from people that had been doing it. Then in 2016, Arkansas passed our program, and it wasn't until May of 2019 that we actually had product available for patients. So it was about a 2.5-year process. And that at the time, that was kind of a quick rollout compared to what some other states were doing. And it really varies from state to state now. Some are taking longer, some are taking shorter. But, you really got to be able to pivot throughout this process. If you watch, states like Illinois is a good example of the date that they said they were going to initially release licenses continues to get pushed back. And part of that was due from COVID, et cetera. So that kind of goes back to the emotional roller coaster aspect of it.
Absolutely. And Dr. Spencer, what about you? You're pretty deep into this process now. What has it been like? How early did you decide to get into this? And what's the experience been like?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with both Robert and John. It's very laborious. It's a very intense process that required a lot of forethought and preparation years before the license was even made available. I started out as being on the Cannabis Council for the governor about 8 years ago, and we were trying to get CBD oil here on the heels of the Charlotte's Web trial, which just looked at seizures in children. And my goal and role was to educate the lawmakers through my testimony on how this can be helpful for adults, not just children with seizures, to really consider expanding the medical use utility of CBD or medical marijuana. So nonetheless, that was something that had me interested very early on. And again, this has been almost like 6 years ago. And so just moving forward, just prepare maybe within the last 3 years, just forming the company, mobilizing a team, and hitting the ground running. So yeah, it's been quite the ride.
Excellent. And for any of the panelists, one of the questions that we get a lot from folks who are thinking about applying for a competitive license is what kind of team do they need to put together before they even sort of start this process? What skill sets do they need on the team, and what can they sort of contract with outside experts for, and what makes a good, compelling team for a license application? What qualities make that solid team?
I can start, I guess. In terms of this, the team at the licensing point, when you're first thinking about wanting to get a license, you want to make sure the people that you're initially working with are people that you know and trust, that bring some skills to the table, be it business management, something from the medical side, accounting. Like, there's many skills that are needed to run a vertically integrated or large scale organization that's highly regulated. But in terms of the skills that you're going to need once you get the license onto paper, that will include cannabis cultivation, if you're going to be a cultivator, dispensing experience if you're doing a dispensary operation. So you need to have those skills reflected, and that's where either contracting or recruiting ahead of time to bring into your core team comes in, because you really need, in a competitive landscape, to be able to demonstrate that from day one you will be prepared to do it. Like, you won't be learning on the job, because there's no room for error in such a highly regulated business. And like, the other aspect is on the financing side is oftentimes like a major falling down point. So thinking about either how and whether you can finance it yourself, or thinking about who you can bring in, because you want to make sure that whoever you're working with as investors are people who are going to be value additive to you in the business and not cause problems or be a potential issue for you in actually getting your business up and running.
And I just wanted to piggyback on that first part about the team structure. Again, state to state, this is different. And you've got your Fortune 50 guys, you've got your farmers, you've got your Black farmers, you've got women, you've got all sectors of communities that are clamoring at these licenses. So it's really, really important that aside from the people that you're putting together, to John's point, that are actually going after this process of applying for the license, that you then are able to make certain that correlates with people that can actually facilitate the operations and becoming a part of being first to market in any of these new emerging states or in this industry. And I think Robert can talk to this. I mean, you're seeing right now, I think today Chris Webber announced that Cookies made an approach to begin job training for minorities that are looking to enter the cannabis space. And there is a lack, a funnel of real true experts that know the true day in and day out formation of operation from seed to sale in one of these types of facilities and or in the dispensary setting. So while that void is there, hopefully there are some approaches being taken in the social equity forefront that speaks to that. But Robert, maybe you can echo in a little bit more about the importance of that second proportion of once you actually receive the license, if on paper the people you have don't reflect what it will take for you to actually get your business up and operating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think John said it best, having partners that bring value to the organization, those strategic partnerships. I mean, throughout the application process, there's a lot of groundwork that you lay down that actually will help out on the launch of your business once you're awarded a license. I mean, and that's your corporate structuring, banking relationships, access to capital, operational experience, SOPs, architecture and engineering. A lot of these merit-based applications require you to go ahead and submit full blueprints of your proposed facilities. So, I mean, it's important not only for the application and making your application stand out from the others. It's also important to go ahead and set that groundwork for the actual launch of the business.
And I would just like to reiterate the importance of having a diverse team. You obviously want to make sure you have a strong skill set and it's people that you really enjoy working with, because you're going to spend a lot of days and late nights together via in person, on the phone, virtually. So you really want to make sure it's a team that you trust. But most of these states are requiring, like Eddie Armstrong mentioned, social equity. And so you want to make sure that you consider any of your friends or colleagues that you want to form your team as veterans of the armed forces in some way, minorities in terms of underrepresented groups, and also women. And because most of the applications have been following the precedents of the other states, where they make sure that there is diversity in the group. So make sure, again, you consider minorities, women, and veterans.
Yeah, absolutely. Social equity laws are becoming much more common, and they look very different from state to state, right? So understanding what social equity means in your state, both in terms of who qualifies as a social equity applicant, and also what social equity applicants get that is different from other applicants. So, Robert, I'm curious, having been through this process and received a license, what do you think it was about your and having frankly scored extremely well in that process, extremely highly, what do you think it was about your team or your application that really made you stand out from some of the other applicants?
I think there's probably two things. First is just the attention to detail I mean, mentioned earlier, architectural plans, and we had all of our packaging and labels already drawn up, and according to the state regulations. We really paid very close attention to what at all of the state meetings, and to figure out what was important, not only what it said on the form, the application form, but what was actually important to the individuals who are going to be scoring these applications. And then secondly, it's the ability to tell your story. A lot of these applications that can be, over 1,000 pages long when it's said and done, there's too much information for any person to actually flip through that and really read it. So it's really the ability to structure it in a narrative format. And so I think it's those two things that really were able to set us apart.
Yeah. And I wanted to add one more thing. It's really important, Robert mentioned, you've got to know the people or know other people that will be scoring the applications. So it's not a bad idea to start to get involved in your local and your state government. You definitely want allies. You definitely want to set yourself apart as a thought leader with a strong, genuine interest. You're not like a big company coming from the outside, just trying to obtain a license, which happens in a lot of states as expected. But you want your face to be familiar. You want to make sure that you have buy-in of your people on the legislative side of things, because you definitely don't want to get pushback, and you want them to be familiar with who you are. And so, again, just wouldn't be a bad idea to, join committees if you can, or be visible when there's public meetings. For us, it was challenging because it's during COVID, so none of the meetings were public. We pretty much had to lay low and do a lot of groundwork on our own and meet with people independently outside of the legislative session. But it's, again, just start to get to know your lawmakers and try to be as supportive and as visible in a positive way as possible.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And really, when I started in this industry, everybody in the industry also had a strong advocacy presence. It was necessary. In a lot of places, you weren't just sort of applying for a license; you were fighting for the right to be able to apply for a license in the first place. So understanding what the political landscape looks like, who are the politicians, who are the legislators, who are the regulators that are going to be making these decisions, what do those decisions look like, are there ways that you can get close to those folks, all super important. And in an ideal world, you can help shape what some of these regulations look like. If you can get yourself into the right position with the right connections, you can help create a regulatory landscape that really is set up for you to thrive and succeed. I'm wondering, John or Eddie, if you can talk a little bit more about the process of how these applications are scored. I know that it's a little bit different in each state, but what should folks be thinking about when they think about how, like, once I send in the application, what's sort of a typical process that might happen next on the regulatory side?
Yeah, it does vary. So as you say, it varies from state to state. Some will tell you, like it's usually a set of different exhibits. Like in Illinois, for example, there were about 12 separate work exhibits that you had to put together of varying length. The longest was about 65 pages that they gave you for the security plan to about 5 pages for an environmental plan. So those are where the priorities can also shift. But in terms of what the scoring will sometimes they'll tell you how many points are available in the overall exhibit, but not tell you what the breakdown is internally. Sometimes they'll be a little bit more granular. So it's really about trying to be as comprehensive as possible to make sure that you've read every word of the law, that it's explicitly what it says, what the rules on the application are saying, that you miss nothing, that at the very least you cover everything, even if it is simply to say, we will do this in compliance with the law if there is no way to otherwise say so. For sometimes applications will happen and when all the rules haven't yet been promulgated. Like Georgia was a case of that, where the new dispensary rules had not been written, but when the cultivation rules were licensing were going on, so you had to basically position it to say whatever it is, we are prepared to be compliant with it.
And I think, Robert, you mentioned the need to be flexible and pivot, and that's an important point. These, in a lot of contexts, more traditional contexts, if you're applying for some kind of license, you're applying for a business license or an alcohol license. A lot of these regulatory processes are long-standing and entrenched. The kinks have been worked out, and the process is a pretty static one. In most cases with these competitive cannabis licenses, you're applying for something that is brand new, and that in many cases the state that created this process probably doesn't fully understand yet. So we do see quite a few pivots and changes, modifications to deadlines. Can any of you talk about maybe Robert or Dr. Spencer about what that's like, and did you have to deal with these sort of last minute changes and unexpected things coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the state not having an understanding of the program they're rolling out is probably a pretty big understatement. And earlier you were mentioning the ability to influence regulators. I mean, that's extremely important because they don't know what they're regulating quite often. But as far as last minute changes, there's advisory memorandums that come out often throughout the process that clarify some things because there's portions of the application guidelines are often quite vague, and so they'll release the application guidelines and you start working on it, and you'll usually have the opportunity to submit some questions and get some guidance on there. But there are often last minute changes, and you really have to be able to be nimble and pivot to get those done and maximize the points.
And I'd say that's especially the case, like in states that are legalizing initially. So being not legal and then medical becoming legal, as opposed to medical switching and then expanding to recreational, because conventionally they've at least worked out some of the bugs. But as Dr. Spencer can no doubt add color to, in Georgia, one of the issues was the law is actually less restrictive than the rules that were then promulgated in terms of the kinds of products you could manufacture. So someone who was working strictly from the law in their production plan could get things very wrong in terms of what they were saying that they were going to be selling.
And to add an extra layer to that, one of the things that I think Dr. Spencer can attest to in the final note is, this team structure is really key and vital, but, being able to have a project manager that knows the nuances of being able to operate in a non-existing space. The rules that are made are brand new rules. Some of them have been adjusted and adapted to as they have been made in certain states. And so having somebody that can actually manage your team and your efforts, in addition to the engineers and the people within the security plans and technology plans, those that may be your horticulturalist or your plant nutrients and science individuals, or even those that may work in your labs as you lay out your footprint and your blueprint of your plan, identifying those types of individuals within your team construct and or within your community or state or county that can be viable resources towards what you're building is really key. Each state was different, so some of this has been trial by fire. Illinois was nothing like Georgia. Missouri was nothing like Illinois, and to some degree they all, have emerged, but there's still a lot of baggage that's going on within two of those states.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we found helpful, because there's so many adjustments, like John mentioned, between the rules versus the law is one of our partners is an attorney, and most people, I would hope, would have a managing group that has in-house counsel or has legal on board, just to make sense of some of the language, so you can know what's included, what's excluded, because oftentimes it can be ambiguous. And so that is something that I think will be helpful, and it was extremely helpful for us having someone on our team, but also our consulting, our cannabis consulting team with Eddie Armstrong. It was just a very solid team, and they were able to make sense, and people were able to weigh in, and the attorneys were able to bounce ideas off of each other, and really try to dissect the language so that we can be compliant, because you don't want to disqualify because you have interpreted the law or the rules in error. So I think that's vital.
Absolutely. So that's a great sort of transition. Let's say that I'm in a state that's about to come online, and I look at the license application process, if it's out, or maybe I'm just anticipating the license application process that is going to be coming out, and I decide that I should probably find the right folks to help. If I came to Cannabis Capital Group and engaged you guys in helping to secure a license, what would that look like? What would I expect that process to look like?
Overall, it depends on the team we're working with. So ideally, we like to work with people and help them build a team that covers a lot of the bases. Like, as Dr. Spencer said, having an in-house counsel is great because that cuts down things like legal costs, because you'll have to retain some kind of attorney. If not, it's gonna be difficult if you don't otherwise. But when we approach it, when you realize that you're competing, even though it's a state market, you are competing in a national market against national players who are going to try to get into those markets with you. So it's about helping the client determine what their strengths are, what they need and what they're missing, and what they could add, and then helping them build a narrative around that and build basically a plan of action. Ideally, you'd work from previous state laws depending on how it seems it's going to go. So if you have like in Illinois, when it became legal for recreational, there have been the previous medical licenses that could be looked at for the application process, as well as other more recent states. And if you look to New York, which hasn't promulgated its rules yet, but its recreational laws mirrors in a lot of ways Illinois' ones. You can look back at previous applications and say, we know the general universe of this. The focus might be different, but it's about figuring out where all the pieces that currently exist with the team, where they are, how much time they're probably going to have based on the law, and then building back from there what needs to be done.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about capital and what you should be prepared to do when it comes to having or raising capital for these licenses. Some states require that you have a location secured prior to applying for a license. That can be costly. Do you have any sort of guidelines or bounds on what someone should be ready with when they decide to start this application process in terms of capital, and then at what points along the process they might sort of go out to seek additional capital?
I want to chime in before John and Robert kind of chew the bone all the way off. I'm delving back to social equity in a way, because this is really important in how we are designing and looking at team structure in new and emerging states. And one of the biggest barriers that I don't want us to glaze over is the access to capital and the opportunities to know that that's an even realistic thing to be able to seek to accomplish what is a goal for many communities that have been really stricken by former history around cannabis or marijuana, and so for our Latinx communities that are 8 times less than African Americans that are 10 times less than our white counterparts, it's a big pill to swallow when you're thinking about how in the world can we come up with this type of capital or these resources to even compete or even be thought of competing. And that's something that I just don't want us to overlook in this conversation, because it's a big bite of the apple, and it's a deterrent for a lot of individuals that are seeking opportunity to capitalize. But John, do you want to dive in here a little bit about that?
And actually, John, just before you do that, I mean, you brought up a really good point, Eddie, about education. And as someone who sort of spends a lot of my time in the investment world, in the capital raising world, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of terminology, there are a lot of concepts that we take for granted that most people in general, and especially folks from Black and Brown communities that might not have had the same access to this kind of financial education, just they don't have any frame of reference for. And it can be really scary and intimidating to even go into the rooms where these conversations are having. And this is something that I've sort of recognized as a problem for a long time, and I'm really excited that we just announced that Arcview, the Arcview Group, and Oaksterdam University have partnered to put together a class that the enrollment is open for now, and it's really designed to get people up to speed on these financial topics and concepts so that you understand what venture capital is and what private equity is and what a Series A round is and what a convertible note is and what liquidation preference means and all of these things that you're going to have to deal with at some point along your capital raising journey. So we've worked really closely with Oaksterdam to put that together, and really think we have an excellent introduction to get people up to speed so they don't have to feel lost or intimidated when they're having these discussions. Yeah, with that, sorry, John, I think you were going to talk a little bit more about this.
I was just going to say that course I think is going to be excellent for that in the sense of cannabis investment education, because you're basically not only have to learn how to run an agribusiness of some kind, a retail if you're doing dispensary, with a lot of medical and sort of pharma aspects that are high security, high compliance, but also have to do a crash course in essentially early stage to mid stage venture capital financing. And not knowing that can be problematic for a lot of reasons. Firstly, because you don't want to be giving away more of your business than you absolutely have to, like for funding, but also want to make sure that whatever funding terms you do agree to will be legal in the state that you're operating in, because a lot of those rules vary from state to state in terms of what qualifies as ownership and what qualifies as transfer of ownership and who's eligible to own a license. So that can also become a problem, like down the line, if you haven't planned that out.
Absolutely. Great. So, Robert or Dr. Spencer, I'm curious to hear what were some of the sort of biggest surprises that you encountered during this process, things that you just didn't expect going in?
Well, when we did this several years ago, we didn't partner with an advisory group, so we underestimated how much capital was going to be needed, both for the application and for the build out and startup of the business. So that was definitely a bit of a surprise. And I guess additionally, difficulty finding real estate. A lot of these states put strict restrictions on real estate. In Arkansas, for example, we had to be 3,000 feet from a school, church, or daycare. And there's a lot of all of those here. So that was a pretty unique challenge. And so those are some of the things that you really need to be working on, from the very beginning. Real estate is one of the most important ones, along with, making sure you have enough capital to be able to get to market quickly.
Yeah, and I would agree too. It's not as easy as one might think just to find dirt, but there's so many regulations and restrictions on where it can be. And in addition to where you're deciding to purchase land, you also need to make sure you know the mayor of that city. You also need to make sure you know where that land has to be located, because with most licensing, they require that it has to be in a certain type of community. Here in Georgia, it's tier 1 and tier 2, but a lot of other states have language where they want it to be in rural areas, because the goal is to provide jobs and opportunity and to revitalize areas. So you have to be savvy on where to purchase the land so that you're following within regulations, but also make sure you're familiar with the lawmakers in that town to make sure they don't push back on having your facility in their community, because that would be wasted time, money, and effort if you secure land that you can't use, either because it's out, because it's not within the regulatory guidelines, or the community is just not on board with having the facility there. The other part of your question where you asked unexpected challenges, I would have to say, is most application processes you expect to be very strict criteria, very strict deadlines, and you just have to be flexible, because even in Georgia, the deadline was changed for when the application was due, and we had to pivot due to a period of time where they allowed applicants to ask questions, but also there were applicants that pushed back on the process itself. So that delayed things quite a bit. And so you just always have to be ready to go at any given time. And so the thing that I did not expect is just having to be so flexible, because most RFPs are very rigid. And I think a lot of the lawmakers and the committee, a lot of times they have to make things up as they go along, or adjust based on the questions that are coming in during the question or community period where they open it up for questions and concerns. So you just, again, have to be ready and be knowledgeable and have a strong team that will enable you to be able to pivot or adjust to any changes that come down the pipe.
And I'll put a big bow on that and say that there's a such thing as faith, or whatever your notation of religious belief is. But there is a real reality here for everyone listening today that this is a risk. And going into this in the new emerging states, we've heard conversations from the state capitol to private meetings that people are really assured when they apply that they are going to win this license. This is going to happen. But going in and not understanding that there's a big risk factor here, and that there are a lot of components to getting there, would be an injustice to yourself and your team and your entire effort. But go with the best consideration to getting a license, and that's where CCG and I think Arcview come to the table. But understand that this is a risk, and this is business, and this happens, and hopefully those that do get them do well by society with them.
So I think we're going to take a few moments for audience Q&A in a moment, but I just want to reiterate how excited we are at Arcview to be partnering with Cannabis Capital Group. Their expertise, their connections, their understanding, like really, really granular understanding of these application processes and their experience winning licenses is fantastic. And to bring that in and connect it to the rest of the Arcview ecosystem with our access to data and market research, our decade plus of experience helping license applicants and license winners raise capital, find strategic partners, is really something that I'm quite excited about. So if you are looking to apply for a license and would like to talk to us more, visit us at arcviewconsulting.com. We can set up some calls with the Arcview team and the Cannabis Capital Group team and talk more specifically about your situation and what collaboration might look like. Before we jump into the audience Q&A, from each of you, is there one final thought that you want folks that are attending this webinar to walk away with?
I can start. Yeah, and I think like the thing to walk away with, to take away, is that be prepared for a lengthy and complicated process. If you think you can handle it yourself or with some support, like make sure that you understand what is going to be expected of you for it. And the best thing you can do in terms of that is to go look at how other states have released their licenses. And if you look through the exhibits and the asks and say, can I do this? And if not, find the people who can as soon as you can.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with John, and I would strongly encourage those where it's not cost prohibitive to have a consulting group. I mean, we have the Cannabis Consulting Group with Eddie Armstrong's group, and I know we would not have been as competitive without them in place. And I always say that it is a part of the budget. You can't afford not to have a consulting team. It's a lot of moving parts, and although you may have a lot of the best and brightest individuals on your team, you want someone with the experience that to know how things should go in and out to present yourself as a competitive package. And so I would just say make sure you set aside money in your budget for a strong consulting group, and just make sure they're reputable, that they've obtained a license somewhere, that they're not getting a license and you're like the first go around. I mean, sometimes that's just going to be what it is, but try to have someone that has experience already with obtaining a license.
I think I'd say that the devil is in the details. I mean, as far as understanding of the law and all of the regulations. I mean, you can't read them enough. You can't go to enough community meetings. And that's really going to be key for understanding and a successful application.
And I'll just harken back to my earlier point. You know, this is a real unique time in American history as we anticipate whatever the federal government does. And for those states that are jumping into this for a number of reasons, the tax benefits to states are key and very beneficial. Look no further than Colorado. Arkansas is doing really well. Illinois' last year's numbers during the pandemic were, chart topping and may even break California's records with, amount of revenue brought into the state. But, for the banks out there on this webinar and others in the financial industry, I look at this industry and I say, wow, what a time for banks to even think of the possibilities of setting up branches and minority communities, harken back to the social equity opportunity, that they could gain lifetime customers through their efforts in these communities, no different than the south side of Chicago or downtown North Little Rock. There are some real unique opportunities there for banks and financial institutions to begin to think about how they can better serve and make a footprint within this industry on the social equity front. The cannabis industry is a space I think that must, take a long, deep look at how they can impact this world. It's something you said, I think, David, a few weeks back. It's something that we all have to play a part in bending the arc of history towards justice. And I think the Cannabis Capital Group, Arcview Capital, and this industry will be very fortunate because of the things that we are trying to do right now as this industry continues to march on. So thank you guys for having us today.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we've got a couple minutes here for some Q&A. Nicole, I'm not sure if we've got questions in from the audience. Things that we don't get to in these last couple of minutes, we may be able to get to in the breakout session that we're going to host right after this. So we'll give more details on that, but that'll really give another opportunity to answer some of the questions you might have.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for our panelists. Really appreciate your insights. There's been a lot of appreciation in the chat. I don't know if you've seen that. So like David said, we only have a couple minutes to get to a few of these questions, but we will be doing that breakout session, and we will put the link in the chat afterwards when we wrap up here. So this first question is for John. When you discuss creating the story narrative, what preliminary approaches do you take to create the story and the differentiators that you weave throughout the application?
That's a great question, and it starts with the founding team and and their individual stories, and crafting the narrative around what their strengths are, what their passion is, and demonstrating not just that they are here and capable of building a successful cannabis business, but why they want to beyond the obvious personal economic incentives. So it's about building the story where it is genuinely felt. I mean, we always try to work with clients who care very much about that and about the particular community in which they're going to be building it. So it's not a cookie cutter, we're going to drop down a facility in this random place. It's here's why this will help this place. Here's why we want to help it. And here's how we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Spencer or Robert, do you want to chime into that? Maybe share a little bit of what you incorporated into your application, what story you told?
For our group, it's the story that we told is the story of all women group and all having some experience on the medical or legal side and taking care of the least of the I think some of the patients and clients that have some of the most challenging issues in terms of having multiple health problems. And so it's 3 physicians and 1 attorney. And our attorney, she is a veteran, as is one of our surgeons. And our attorney also specializes in elder law. And on the medical side, all 3 of us ladies are surgeons, but have seen just the challenges of the opioid epidemic and having to prescribe pain medications to our patients. We felt like they needed a safer option where they weren't at risk for overdosing, they weren't at risk for addiction, and they weren't at risk for interacting with their other medications. And so it bore a lot out of frustration, both passion, but also frustration, because we felt like people needed a better option that decreased their suffering and decrease their ability to have these opioids that put them in a position where they were codependent on medication, and of course all the side effects associated with the opioids as well. And so that was basically our story. All women, veterans, medical, legal, with a vested personal and professional interest in just making the lives of Georgians better by being able to offer this to everyone.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Robert?
You're welcome.
Our story wasn't too different from Dr. Spencer's. Our ownership is mainly comprised of physicians, so we really focused on creating medicine out of this plant and the benefit that it will have for our community here in Arkansas.
Great. Thank you so much. Looks like we have time just for one more question, and it's an important one. So David, how do you go about reviewing your final applications to ensure you've met the requirements and that all of the elements tie together in a unified whole? How do you ensure impact and credibility to your review team?
I'd love to have either John or Eddie answer that question. I think they've got significantly more experience than I do with that process.
I can chime in. It's really about having as many eyes within the team go through it as possible. And sometimes that becomes a rush towards the end where everyone's doing it at the same time, but making sure that everyone is working from the same document and same version and ensuring that nothing is missed. So just going through the checklist, making sure that everything, and not doing it not any one person doing it, and making sure that it's always being talked about in the same language and then reviewed by multiple eyes.
Making that adjustable per state. You're going to have unique personalities at the table. Dr. Spencer's group, there were days they were coming out of surgeries and, very, 5 o'clock alarm moments. But being able to coalesce those individuals with those that actually know what it takes to do this, to either operate a cultivation and or dispensary and or in the ancillary business space now, where you're seeing transporter licenses or distribution licenses come to the forefront. The expertise are going to be needed. The legal is going to be needed. The project management or position of a project manager is going to be needed. Because there are several incremental steps towards, the deadline of any one of these applications being done. And who knows if we will see another pandemic. Hopefully everybody's vaccinated or getting there. But if you're not, who knows what the future of the world holds. And we could be looking at another moment where everything's at hold like it was in Georgia, and then all of a sudden it's go. Or Mississippi, where the Supreme Court's overturned it and we're back at the starting gate to some degree. Or in Missouri, where things are still up in arms. There's all of these different nuances to the expected unexpecteds. And to have only money at the table or influence and power at the table does you, your team, or your efforts at the end of the day not all the good you'll need in order to accomplish your overall end game goal.
And a final point that I'll leave you with is one that was talked about a little bit during this webinar, which is the importance of getting involved. In addition to my work at the Arcview group, I sit on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, as well as the Marijuana Policy Project, both great organizations. If you're a person of color and you're in this industry or thinking about getting in this industry, definitely check out MCBA. Membership offers all sorts of benefits and resources that can help you along your cannabis journey. Marijuana Policy Project is responsible for getting laws passed in just so many of the states that have legal, medical, and adult use cannabis, and donating to them is an important way to ensure that we continue to have more and more states and opportunities to get licenses that open up. And it's also really a good way to tie yourself into an organization that has its finger on the pulse of what's happening and how these laws are changing. So definitely find all the ways you can to get involved early and as much as possible. And hopefully you'll join us in a moment here for a breakout session.
Thanks, David. I will pass it back to you to wrap up. I just put the link in the chat for the breakout session, so hope to see everybody over there.
Great. Yeah, and this breakout session will give us all a chance to sort of have a little bit more of an intimate setting to have deeper discussions and maybe answer some of your questions. We've got a little poll that's popping up now. We'd love it if you complete that, and also take a look at some of the upcoming programs that we've got coming up. We put on webinars, educational webinars, quite frequently, and we've had some really interesting stuff coming up through the end of May and into June. Always a good time. So make sure to visit arcviewaccess.com and sign up for those if you'd like to join us for those as well. And thanks for coming, and I'll see some of you in this breakout session in a moment.